Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Michael Hanna, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and an avid follower of Egypt and a good person to talk to today about Egypt and Libya, two topics that we have not really talked about here on the Middle East Brief. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I mean, for listeners, who are following this podcast, perhaps because of my own biases, I've been approaching the Libya question from basically the Turkish side of things. And so there's been a lot of news recently about the Egyptian side of things as the Turkish-backed forces have sort of reversed the momentum of the Egyptian-backed forces. And I would say the country is more or less split now east versus west. So I wonder if you could just pick up the story there and just give the listeners sort of like the latest of what's been happening in Egyptian foreign policy and politics as it pertains to Libya.
Yeah, so it has been a kind of humbling reversal for Egyptian-backed forces. They undertook a very ill-advised military operation last year to try to effectively take over the country, to take on Tripoli. That's failed miserably. They're in retreat. Turkish-backed forces seem to have the momentum. And Egypt, which has been worried about Libya for years now and has been involved in backing up General Haftar and his forces since really the beginning of effectively what has become a civil war. And seeing this reversal, Egypt is in the news because President Sisi made a speech on Sunday where he effectively threatened to intervene if Turkish-backed forces move east of onto the city of Sirte toward the Oil Crescent, and effectively moving on the east. And obviously, this has garnered a lot of attention. Egypt has effectively drawn a line in the sand, and Egypt has generally been quite restrained in terms of its military and intervention in the kind of post-uprisings environment. So since really 2011 and more pointedly since 2013 when Sisi ousted the Muslim Brotherhood president, Mohammed Morsi. And this has been a period characterized by military adventurism throughout the region. We see the latest episode of that now. But, this is a stark change from the status quo ante. And so we've seen much more independent action on the part of the Emirates, on the part of the Saudis, on the part of the Turks. Egypt has been involved in Libya, but not directly so, other than one isolated incident in 2015. So the speech garnered a lot of attention. It was echoed today by the Egyptian ally, the leader of the Libyan House of Representatives, who said that if Turkish-backed forces move on Sirte, that they would call upon and request for Egyptian intervention and really reinforcing Sisi's call. And so, it's a stark call on the part of Egypt, but now really escalation dynamics are going to be controlled by Turkey. And so, I think everybody is waiting to see if there is going to be a kind of accelerated diplomatic movement to try to halt the potential for further escalation. The Emirati Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Anwar Gargash, had a comment today noting the real possibility for regional escalation and calling on diplomacy. And obviously, the Emirates are heavily involved alongside Egypt in the east of Libya. And so, there's this real question whether Turkey, how they see this speech by Sisi, whether they understand this to be a bluff or a real threat of meaningful military intervention, and whether that will make any difference. But now it's sort of out of Egypt's hands, and that's probably a pretty uncomfortable position for Egypt to be in. But it's hard to imagine that they would do nothing now in the face of a kind of Turkish-backed escalation. Now, there are a lot of options. It doesn't have to be a kind of direct maneuver of Egyptian personnel and equipment to have a direct confrontation. There are various levels of intervention and engagement, and we can get into that. But it does seem to me to be a pretty delicate moment, and I do think the possibility for escalation is real. And of course, as I mentioned, the Emiratis are involved, the Egyptians are involved, the Russians are also involved to some extent as well. They have an air base in the east, and we've heard some words of caution and concern from European leaders like President Macron of France. There are quite a few outside players involved in Libya. And so I think it's a fairly combustible mix of circumstances and players.
Right. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that the Egyptian leader Sisi, gave that speech, and he chose to do it in a very sort of orchestrated way. I mean, I think the backdrop was fighter jets, something along those lines. He was at a military base, and so it was quite clear what he was signaling. I've seen sort of speculation that comes after this is that, and you see this a lot with the Turks, which is, well, they make these sort of bellicose statements. They make their intentions clear. What we would call signaling. They're quite clearly signaling what they want to do, what they intend to do, even if it may not sort of be to the level of full-scale conflict or intervention. But then people try and poke holes in this, in that they can't do that because they're not militarily capable, they're not properly equipped. The supply lines are long. You sort of go down the list. So if I told you the number of people who are saying, well, Turks can't really affect change in Libya because it's too far, I would, and I got $1 for every person who said that, I wouldn't be rich, but I would be able to buy a couple of cappuccinos every single day for the next couple of weeks. I see the same thing happening with the Egyptians right now. So I mean, what's your read on those escalation dynamics? I mean, before we can get into the Turks and what they're doing, think?
I mean, I don't think this is a bluff, right? So I think that there are some on the Turkish side that look at Egypt's kind of intractable war of attrition in North Sinai against militants there. Not it's the Egyptian military's finest hour. This conflict's been going on for years without any kind of resolution. They see Egypt's escalating diplomatic confrontation with Ethiopia surrounding the filling of the reservoir for the Renaissance Dam. And of course, it comes in the midst of escalating public health catastrophe in Egypt as COVID and viral transmission increases pretty markedly with its attendant economic effects. So this is a pretty challenging moment for Egypt and for President Sisi. But that being said, I don't think, again, that this is simply a kind of bluff. Egypt has long been concerned about Libya, and that is both a kind of security question about the East specifically. I should note that when Haftar decided to move further west and to try to retake Tripoli, Egypt eventually supported him, but this was definitely not a kind of Egyptian engineered plan. They were hesitant. They definitely counseled against it. But once their partner in Libya moved forward, they felt compelled to back him. But what they care about really is the East. So there is a security question about militancy next door to Egypt, this massive, basically indefensible border that abuts the Western Desert, a huge expanse of territory in Egypt that, again, is very difficult for Egypt to fully defend. And there's an ideological component to this, particularly when this intervention began for the Emiratis and the Egyptians in 2014, when they saw this as part of their regional policy to combat the spread of Islamism and Islamist forces. In Egyptian shorthand, that's oftentimes referred to as the Muslim Brotherhood. But the GNA and the Libyan parties in the West were seen in a kind of monochromatic brush by Egypt as being Islamist leaning. And so, it was part of both their security mindset and their ideological approach to regional policy. That being said, the other side of Egypt's regional policy has, as I mentioned previously, been fairly restrained. The most stark example of that comes in 2015 when Saudi Arabia, Egypt's most important regional patron, that led the effort to shore up the Sisi's government following the ouster of Morsi, corralling the Emirates and the Kuwaitis together to chip in $20 billion of aid in the immediate aftermath of the coup. And when the Saudis, their chief patron, came to them to ask them to back up their intervention in what has been a fairly disastrous war in Yemen, the Egyptians flatly said no. I think perhaps shocking the Saudis, but Egypt, of course, has long troubled history in the 60s in Yemen, and saw this as a kind of losing proposition and eschewed direct intervention in that conflict to support their regional partner. So, Egypt is and has been risk averse in terms of engaging directly. But now that they have effectively drawn this line in the sand, Egyptian credibility is on the line in a way that I think complicates the situation. And so, again, there are a variety of things that could happen if the Turks push forward. We could see the deployment of Egyptian personnel to shore up Benghazi and areas further east to free up Haftar and his forces to push forward. So it doesn't have to be, a kind of Egyptian-led offensive to defend Sirte. But I do think this isn't something that has been taken lightly, not a decision that has been taken lightly, and I do think Egypt would be forced to engage in some overt and material way if Turkey decides to push their partners forward.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I think the Turks' preference right now is for a sort of extended ceasefire, sort of brokered by them and the Russians, that leads to long-term negotiations. Where I think the stumbling block will be, and where the risks for escalation come, is that it's the question of Haftar, right? So the Turks will not negotiate with him, or if they will, they're extremely skeptical of him and would like to see him replaced as an interlocutor, because they refer to him as a sort of putschist or a warlord or a coup general along that lines. And whether or not the backers of Haftar, so including the Egyptians, can effectively keep their partner force together, even if they wanted to sort of decapitate their partner force and elevate somebody else to take his place, to come to a negotiated settlement. And so while I do think we may be in line for a freezing of the conflict lines, I'm not sure that any of the drivers of the conflict can be addressed, at least in the interim. And so I'm actually quite concerned about escalation, because partner forces don't always act at the whim or behest of their backers. As you were just describing, Egypt was not a fan of the Tripoli offensive, even though it ultimately had to sort of throw its weight behind it. Where if you have sort of extended militia lines around Sirte and they decide to sort of shell it or do indirect fire, does that eventually trigger the Egyptian cross-border move? And if so, where do they go, right? Because I mean, this is not to sort of like get into the game of saying that the Egyptian armed forces are of inferior quality. There's a lot of them, and if you put a whole bunch of steel into Libya, that becomes destabilizing all on its own. And so that's where I'm concerned. So if I had to ask you about the Egyptian sort of predilection towards compromise, where do you think we are on that? Because do they think that they need to strengthen their hands? Do they think that they can cut ties and reach compromise? Or are they, so wary of Turkish expansionism that they feel like they have to push back against it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a way out, a de-escalatory way out toward a ceasefire. I mean, I think ceasefire is the Egyptian preference as well. So, Sisi's statement had several, beyond the kind of warnings to Turkey and the forces from the West. This was essentially previewing the Egyptian view of what a ceasefire line could look like and should look like in their eyes. And it was also a signal to their partners in the East, right? I think there was a real fear about defections and other forces aligned with Haftar effectively, turning sides. And so this was another signal to those partners in the East that Egypt was still committed to the security of the east of Libya. And so, that being said, if Egypt had its druthers, it clearly wouldn't be a kind of escalating conflict. Obviously, Turkish military maneuvering and presence in the region is something that is of concern to Egypt. It's complicated by the Eastern Mediterranean and jockeying over gas and natural resources. There's the fears about Turkish deployment in Sudan, in Suakin, the island. So this is a concern. I don't think that Egypt at this point imagines that can be easily reversed, particularly in Libya and particularly after this period of relative military success that has really changed the dynamics of the conflict. So I do think that this is effectively laying out a possibility for a diplomatic exit from this current crisis and a way to de-escalate. But again, Egypt and Turkey are important players. On the eastern side, there's also the Emiratis and the Russians, but they don't necessarily, at the end of the day, have complete control over their partners on the ground. And so, there are a lot of ways for this to escalate by accident, effectively. But I do think Egypt would be satisfied with that kind of diplomatic off-ramp.
How would you then compare the Emirati and the Egyptian points of view on this? I mean, are they linked up, or are there cracks between them? I mean, because the way I view the Russians, scholars or followers who listen to this podcast can correct me, is I saw their introduction of aircraft as, which the U.S. has sort of publicized and which is easily trackable using open source tools. Well, one, it was a recognition that Turkish drones were wreaking havoc, and there needed to be protection for evacuating convoys, particularly of Russian mercenaries. That's one. But two is that they are sort of de facto held as a hedge if, I guess you would call it a ceasefire, or sort of like the operational pause, I mean, whatever word we want to use, begins to break down, and that the sort of articulated red line of pushing towards the airbase or pushing on Sirte comes to fruition. Now, that's a guess, or that's a hypothesis. And when I hear you talk about Egypt is that there seems to be some sort of overlap and linkages between the Russian and Egyptian position, but I don't know how coordinated they are. And of course, the Emiratis, I would say, have been the most obstinate of the outside backers. And so, where are they in this? Because if I had to actually put the country on the sort of spectrums of most willing to compromise, I would actually say Turkey is probably the country most willing to compromise, and the Russians. But I'm not sure if that's accurate given sort of your expertise on Egypt and their thoughts on the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that Russia's deployment writ large seems much more opportunistic and flexible in that sense. I do think that the Emiratis are a more important player in the East, and Egypt and the Emirates have coordinated very closely. I mean, Egypt has served as the kind of logistical hub through which Emirati aid and assistance has flowed into Libya. There are suggestions now that the Emiratis are also themselves becoming a little bit more flexible, and that there's a possibility that they're looking at alternatives to Haftar, that they're committed to the East, like Egypt, and not necessarily to the person himself. I think we'll need more evidence of that before we can assume that that's really the case. But I do think in the case of Egypt, I think Haftar became a convenient vehicle for Egypt to latch onto, and was easy to do so for a variety of reasons. But I don't think that commitment is an individual one as opposed to a broader one. And so it will be interesting to see what this very obstinate man does if there is a kind of concerted diplomatic effort to avert escalation, which I would imagine Turkey might predicate on the disposition of Haftar and what happens to him in the future. So, what happens to the man, I think, is a central question. It seems as if the Emiratis are thinking about this as well. But we haven't seen any kind of effort to engineer alternatives to him yet.
So final question as we wrap up here, and I'm going to try and put you on the spot. Like if you had to make predictions, and I know prediction is folly, and I hate making predictions when people ask me to do this, but I'm nevertheless going to ask you. It's super important, and obviously it's a really interesting issue. I mean, interesting in sort of the academic sense, but quite risky in terms of the geopolitical sense, as to what Egypt's next move are. I mean, clearly, look, I'm not following this nearly as closely as you are. But when I watched at least the sort of somebody live tweeting that speech, because I can't understand him, speaking, because I don't speak Arabic, I read that as, look, he's trying to give himself off ramps, but he's also saying we're prepared to do this. And if there is a breakdown and countries do sort of treat it as a bluff when he doesn't mean it as a bluff, are we going to end up in this position where there are overt and comparatively large numbers of Egyptian military forces sprinkled throughout eastern Libya? And if so, what does that mean for the future of the country? Because look, I'm the Turkey guy, and so I sort of live on Turkey Twitter, and these people are entirely buoyant about what they see as a successful military operation. As somebody who's followed a lot of military operations in my life, yes, this has been tactically successful, but I don't see how it leads without compromise to a solution where the front line just doesn't fissure and freeze over, and that there aren't just flare-ups once every 6 months or once every 6 weeks. So if I'm going to ask you, have the Egyptians backed themselves into a corner, and are we looking at a position where we're going to have two antagonistic actors within mortar ranges of one another?
I think that's a real possibility. I don't have a hard time, putting, percentages on any of these things. I do think that Turkish buoyancy that you referenced is an important factor here. I worry about Turkish overreach. The Turkey-Egypt rivalry and has been sharp since the coup. Since 2013, they have effectively broken relations with each other. The issue of Egypt is something that's quite personal for Erdogan. I don't know how that factors into decision making about this conflict, but I do worry that kind of animosity and the buoyancy that comes from their tactical success in changing the complexion of the conflict in Libya could lead to overreach. And in that case, I do think that Egypt has, through this very overt effort to signal its red lines, has painted itself into a corner. And I think they would be faced with a very big decision that would be hard to back down from completely. Now, again, there's a range of options as to what that could mean. But at this moment, when the United States and a lot of other folks are consumed with their own domestic crises, there is a global pandemic. There is the massive economic aftershocks of that, and this supremely weird moment in American political life, that all hinges on an election in November. There's an absence of engaged diplomatic activity, and that kind of void and drift is the kind of situation that could lead to misperception and kind of stumbling into conflict. And so when you posit the possibility of significant Egyptian forces in Libya, yes, I think that's something that could happen. I think it's not the most likely. I think the stakes are such, and kind of the kinds of fears that the Emiratis have expressed publicly today about regional escalation will hopefully temper the expectations of the interested parties. But I do think it's a dangerous moment, and I do think Egypt has kind of set the conditions that may force their hand. I understand the reason they have done so, but they might be forced to take actions that they are and have been reluctant to do in the past.
Michael, this has been great, man. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
And thank you, everybody, for listening, and keep watching Libya.